On March 2, 2026, 72 hours after Operation Epic Fury began, a video appeared on Iranian state television. The footage showed what appeared to be a massive explosion on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. Fire, smoke, aircraft sliding off the deck into the ocean. The narrator, speaking in Farsi, declared that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had successfully struck the USS Abraham Lincoln with a ballistic missile in the northern Arabian Sea. The video was viewed 40 million times in 24 hours. There was one problem: the USS Abraham Lincoln was fine. CENTCOM released a photograph of the Lincoln taken that same afternoon. Full flight deck, aircraft parked in normal configuration. No damage, no fire. The carrier had launched 47 sorties in the previous 12 hours. The Iranian video was fabricated, and the manner in which it was fabricated, the specific details that were wrong, the production choices that revealed its origins, and the desperate strategic logic behind its creation tell you more about the true state of the war than anything CENTCOM announced that week. This video is about what that fabrication reveals. To understand why Iran produced the video, you need to understand what was happening to Iran on March 2nd. Operation Epic Fury had begun 4 days earlier. In those 4 days, the Iranian naval surface fleet had been effectively destroyed. The bases at Bandar Abbas and Konarak had been struck repeatedly. The Shahid Bagheri drone carrier, which Iranian commanders had believed would be a significant asymmetric asset, had been destroyed at Pier before it launched a single drone. The fast attack boat swarms that had defined Iranian naval doctrine for 2 decades had been eliminated faster than commanders could process what was happening. Iran had fired hypersonic missiles at the Lincoln. They missed. Iran had launched drone swarms. They were destroyed. Iran had positioned the Iris Dina 2,500 miles east as a surviving threat asset. It would be gone in 4 more days. On the ground, the Iranian military was intact. The Air Force had not launched. The Army had not engaged. The Revolutionary Guard ground forces were in their bases. But the Navy, the force Iran had spent 30 years building as its primary deterrent against American carrier power, was gone. The regime needed a different narrative, urgently. The video itself was a production. Understanding how it was made reveals how quickly and how desperately it was assembled. The explosion footage was not original. Iranian intelligence services and IRGC media units maintain extensive archives of maritime explosion footage, training accident footage, and historical naval combat imagery from conflicts going back decades. The footage of the carrier fire was sourced from an old training exercise involving a decommissioned vessel. The exact source has not been officially confirmed, but open-source analysts identified the hull configuration and island superstructure dimensions as inconsistent with a Nimitz-class carrier within hours of the video's release. The narration was recorded separately and laid over the footage. The timestamps shown in the video were inconsistent with the claimed time of the strike. The coordinates displayed on screen did not correspond to the Lincoln's actual operating area in the northern Arabian Sea. They were off by approximately 340 nautical miles, placing the supposed strike in waters the Lincoln had not occupied for several days. These were not small errors made under pressure. They were fundamental production failures that any competent video analyst could identify in under an hour. And within 2 hours of the video's release, multiple open-source intelligence accounts had done exactly that. The question is not whether the video was fake. It obviously was. The question is what Iran was trying to accomplish by releasing it, and what the release tells us about the actual decision-making inside the Iranian government on March 2nd. Before examining what the video reveals about Iranian decision-making, it is worth understanding the institutional machinery that produced it so quickly. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has a dedicated media and information warfare apparatus that has been developing for decades. The IRGC Cyber Command, established formally in 2012, coordinates digital information operations across multiple platforms. The IRGC, affiliated Tasnim News Agency, and Fars News Agency function as rapid response outlets that can publish content within minutes of receiving it from IRGC sources. State television channels, including Press TV, which broadcasts in English, and Channel 2 of IRIB, the national broadcaster, maintain production infrastructure capable of assembling broadcast-quality content on short notice. The Lincoln video was not assembled by amateurs. It was assembled by professionals working under extreme time pressure with inadequate oversight. The distinction matters. The errors in the video are not the errors of people who do not know how to make videos. They are the errors of people who know exactly how to make videos, but who were given fabricated source material, an impossible deadline, and instructions that prioritized speed over accuracy. The person who laid the explosion footage over the narration knew it was not real footage of the Lincoln. The graphics operator who added the coordinates to the screen knew the numbers were invented. The narrator reading the script knew the events described had not occurred. They produced the video anyway. Because the institutional pressure to produce something, anything, that could be broadcast as a victory on day 4 of a catastrophic military defeat was stronger than the professional instinct to verify what they were being asked to present. This tells you something important about how the Iranian state information apparatus functions under pressure. It is not a system designed to discover and communicate truth. It is a system designed to produce politically useful content. Under normal conditions, when the regime is not losing a war, politically useful content and broadly accurate content overlap enough that the distinction does not matter much. Under crisis conditions, they diverge completely. And when they diverge, the system produces politically useful content regardless of its accuracy. There is a concept in information warfare called the domestic audience problem. It describes the situation where a government at war needs to tell its own population something different from what it is telling the outside world, and where those two messages are fundamentally incompatible. Iran's leadership faced an acute version of this problem on March 2nd. The outside world, and specifically the United States, the Gulf states, China, and Russia, already knew the truth. CENTCOM was releasing battle damage assessments. Satellite imagery was being published by commercial providers showing the state of Iranian naval bases. Allied intelligence services had complete situational awareness. The Iranian government could not fabricate a narrative for the outside world. The outside world had too many independent data sources. But the Iranian domestic audience was different. State media controlled most of the information environment inside Iran. Social media platforms were throttled. International news sources were filtered. The regime had been managing domestic information about the war since the first strikes on February 28th, describing the conflict as a defensive operation against American aggression, while being careful not to describe specific Iranian losses. The Lincoln video was for domestic consumption. It was not intended to deceive the Pentagon. It was intended to give Iranian citizens a moment of perceived victory in a week when the actual military situation was catastrophic. This is a classic wartime information operation directed inward rather than outward, and it is almost always a sign of a government that is losing. The forensic analysis of the video produced by open-source investigators in the 48 hours after its release was remarkable for its speed and thoroughness. The carrier hull visible in the explosion footage was identified as having an angled deck configuration inconsistent with Nimitz-class carriers. The island superstructure proportions were wrong. The aircraft visible on deck before the explosion were identified as models that have not been in active U.S. Navy service for over a decade. The explosion itself was identified from multiple angles in existing footage databases. The same explosion had appeared in a 2019 documentary about naval training exercises. The flames were coming from the wrong side of the ship relative to the claimed missile impact point. The sea state in the footage was inconsistent with the weather conditions reported in the northern Arabian Sea on the claimed date of the strike. The watercolor and wave patterns suggested a different ocean entirely, possibly the Mediterranean or the North Atlantic, based on the light spectrum and surface characteristics. The coordinates displayed on the screen during the broadcast were in a format inconsistent with standard Iranian military coordinate notation, but consistent with a format used by Iranian state television graphics departments. This suggested the coordinates were added by a graphics team without military input, and that the team did not have access to actual targeting data because no such data existed. What made the debunking so fast was the nature of the open-source intelligence community that has developed over the past decade. In 2003, analyzing the credibility of a government video claim required access to classified databases and specialized analysts working inside government agencies. In 2026, it required a laptop, access to publicly available footage archives, and familiarity with ship identification databases that any serious naval analyst maintains. The OSINT community, the network of independent analysts, journalists, academics, and hobbyists who use publicly available information to analyze military and political events, had been growing rapidly since the early 2000s. Organizations like Bellingcat, individual analysts on social media platforms, and academic research groups had developed methodologies for video verification, satellite imagery analysis, and geolocation that rivaled government capabilities for many classes of problem. The Lincoln video was exactly the kind of problem this community was built to solve. Within 90 minutes of its broadcast, multiple independent analysts had posted detailed debunking threads identifying specific inconsistencies. Within 4 hours, those threads had been aggregated and published by major international news organizations. Within 6 hours, the fabrication was the story, not the original claim. The speed of that debunking cycle is itself historically significant. Iranian information operations in earlier conflicts, before the OSINT community matured, had longer windows of effectiveness. A fabricated claim in 2005 or 2010 might circulate for days before being definitively debunked. In 2026, the window was measured in hours. Every element of the video examined individually pointed to the same conclusion. This was not a recording of an actual event. This was a production assembled from archival materials by a team working under significant time pressure with inadequate oversight. The pressure and the inadequate oversight are both significant details. What the video tells us about Iranian decision-making on March 2nd is more important than the video itself. The release of fabricated combat footage by a state military is not a casual decision. It requires approval from senior levels of the information warfare apparatus. It involves legal and political risk if exposed, which in this case it was, almost immediately. It represents a commitment to a narrative that subsequent events will either confirm or contradict. Iranian leadership approved this video knowing that it was fabricated. They approved it knowing that sophisticated outside observers would identify it as fabricated within hours. They approved it anyway. This tells you that the domestic audience pressure on March 2nd was severe enough that Iranian leadership was willing to absorb the international embarrassment of an exposed fabrication in exchange for the short-term domestic narrative benefit of a fake victory. It tells you that the regime had no actual military victories to present to its population by day 4 of the conflict. It tells you that the information control apparatus inside Iran was functioning well enough that leadership believed a significant portion of the domestic audience would not see the debunking. And it tells you that the decision-making speed inside the Iranian government was degraded. A fabrication this poorly constructed, released this quickly, with this many identifiable errors, is not the product of a government operating with careful deliberation. It is the product of a government reacting to a crisis faster than its quality control processes could function. There is a parallel worth drawing here. In the 1991 Gulf War, Iraqi state television broadcast footage of Saddam Hussein meeting with captured American pilots, apparently in good health and apparently cooperative. The footage was intended to demonstrate Iraqi strength and American vulnerability. The footage was real. The pilots had been captured. But the broadcast backfired internationally because it showed the pilots making statements under duress, which generated outrage rather than the intended impression of Iraqi control over the situation. Iran's March 2nd broadcast was worse. The footage was not real, and it was identified as not real almost immediately. The backfire was faster and more complete. But the underlying logic was identical. A government losing a military conflict needed a domestic narrative of resistance and strength. It reached for the easiest available tool, which was its state media apparatus, and it produced something that revealed more about its actual situation than it concealed. The USS Abraham Lincoln was not struck on March 2, 2026. But the video Iran produced that day and the circumstances that produced it tell you as much about the state of the war as any CENTCOM battle damage assessment. A government that fabricates its own victories and does so badly and does so on day 4 of a conflict is a government that has already decided how the conflict is going to end. It is trying to decide how to explain that ending to the people it governs. There is one final element of the Lincoln video story that matters for understanding what came next. The video was exposed as a fabrication within hours. Iranian state media did not retract it. It did not issue a correction. It continued broadcasting the original footage and the original narrative for several more days, even as the international community, Iranian diaspora media, and eventually some domestic Iranian social media accounts began circulating the debunking. This is the behavior of an information apparatus that has committed to a narrative and cannot reverse course without admitting the fabrication. The cost of retraction, admitting to the domestic audience that the video was fake, that the Lincoln was not struck, that the Navy was gone, was higher than the cost of continuing to broadcast something the outside world knew was false. It is also the behavior of an information apparatus that is no longer primarily concerned with credibility. Credibility requires the possibility of being believed. On March 2, 2026, Iranian state media was no longer trying to be believed by sophisticated observers. It was trying to maintain a narrative for an audience that had limited access to alternative information sources. The Lincoln sailed on. The flight deck remained intact. The sorties continued. The video played on Iranian state television for 3 more days. And somewhere in the northern Arabian Sea, the crew of the USS Abraham Lincoln watched their flight operations continue without interruption, unaware that on the other side of the information divide, they had already been sunk. The Lincoln video was not the only Iranian information operation during Epic Fury. It was the most visible and the most rapidly debunked, but it was part of a broader pattern. In the first week of the conflict, Iranian state media and affiliated social media accounts published claims of shooting down 4 American F/A-18 aircraft, sinking a destroyer with a torpedo, and successfully striking an American logistics vessel in the Red Sea. None of these events were confirmed by CENTCOM, by allied governments, by commercial satellite imagery, or by any independent verification. The pattern reveals something important about how modern information warfare actually functions when one side has a significant battlefield disadvantage. Iran did not expect these fabrications to be believed by the United States, by Western governments, or by sophisticated international observers. The audience for each claim was specific and segmented: the domestic Iranian audience. The populations of regional states where Iranian-aligned media has significant reach. Certain segments of international audiences predisposed to skepticism about American military claims. The goal was not truth. The goal was narrative saturation. Produce enough competing claims that the overall information environment becomes confused, that people who are not paying close attention are uncertain about what actually happened, that the clean American narrative of a decisive military victory is complicated by the existence of alternative accounts, even if those accounts are fabricated. This is a documented information warfare doctrine. Russia used it extensively in Ukraine, starting in 2014. It is sometimes called the fire hose of falsehood. The idea is not that each individual lie is believed, but that the cumulative effect of many lies is a population that is uncertain about everything, and therefore more susceptible to narratives that confirm its existing biases. Iran's version of this doctrine, executed under the pressure of a rapidly deteriorating military situation, was less sophisticated and less well-resourced than Russian variants. The fabrications were identified quickly. The debunking spread faster than the original claims in most international media environments. But inside Iran, where the information environment was more controlled, the effect was different. And that difference is why the fabrications continued even after they were exposed internationally. The domestic audience they were designed for never fully saw the exposure. The Lincoln video was fake. Every analyst who looked at it knew it within 2 hours. 40 million people saw it before those analysts finished their work.